After 40 years, all he left me was a key and a place nobody wanted.
Mabel Renshaw was 70 years old when her husband gave her the key to a place he believed matched her worth. Not the house she had cleaned for 40 years. Not the savings she helped protect. Not the car she rode into every doctor's appointment, grocery trip, and funeral. Just one rusted key to a rotting cabin outside Athens County, Ohio. Calvin did not hand it to her himself. He left it in an envelope on the kitchen counter, where the roof leaked and the floorboards smelled like wet wood. Across the front, in his handwriting, were 3 words: Mabel's property now. That was the whole marriage, reduced to a label. That night, Mabel slept in her coat while rain dropped into a metal bowl beside the bed. No one called. No one checked. And the town that once smiled at her in church let her disappear down a back road like she had already stopped mattering. Then, before sunrise, headlights moved behind the cabin. 2 utility workers walked near the tree line with flashlights, clipboards, and keys to a locked metal box Mabel had never seen. They never looked at the cabin, only the land behind it. And if stories like this still make you feel something, if you believe a woman's years, sacrifices, and quiet suffering should count for more than a rusted key, subscribe now, because Mabel's story is not over. And walking away too early is exactly what people like Calvin expected everyone to do. The utility workers did not knock. That was the part Mabel could not stop thinking about. They had driven behind the cabin before sunrise, but unlocked something near the tree line, written notes on a clipboard, and left without coming to the door, as if they had permission, as if they had been there before, as if the land behind the cabin mattered more than the woman shivering inside it. Mabel stood at the cracked kitchen window long after their taillights vanished through the trees. The room behind her was cold. Rainwater tapped into a metal bowl near the wall. Somewhere under the sink, a mouse scratched once, then went still. On the counter sat the envelope Calvin had left behind. Mabel's property now. 3 words. Neat handwriting. A clean little cruelty. For 40 years, Calvin Renshaw had known how to make an insult look reasonable. He did it in public with a smile. He did it in court with paperwork. And now he had done it with a key. The cabin had come from Mabel's mother's side of the family, but Calvin had never called it that. To him, it was always that old ruin. Something useless, something embarrassing, something he could laugh about when friends came over for dinner. Mabel had laughed too sometimes. Not because it was funny, because peace in Calvin's house often cost less than honesty. During the divorce, every useful thing seemed to find its way to him. The paid-off house, most of the savings, the newer car, the furniture he once said he did not care about. Calvin's attorney described the cabin as a low-value rural structure with limited market appeal. The words sounded official enough that no one questioned them. Mabel did not question them either. Not then. She had been too tired, too embarrassed, too used to letting other people sound certain. But now, looking toward the backfield, she remembered something. A summer from childhood, her uncle standing on this same land, pointing past the trees and telling the children not to play near the metal posts. She remembered the posts clearly now. Dull gray, half swallowed by weeds, lined up like they were marking something no one wanted explained. The adults had lowered their voices whenever that part of the property came up. Then they changed the subject. Mabel had not thought about it in decades. Until this morning. Until strangers with flashlights walked straight toward those same posts like they knew exactly what they were looking for. She picked up Calvin's envelope. The paper had softened in the damp air. The key pressed into her palm, cold and hard. Calvin had fought for everything he believed had value. He fought for accounts. He fought for furniture. He fought for a car he barely drove. But the cabin, he let her have it. Mabel looked again through the window. The workers were gone, but their tire tracks remained 2 dark lines pressed into the wet grass, leading toward the old posts behind the trees. And beside one of those posts, half hidden under weeds, something caught the morning light. A small metal plate. stamped with numbers. Mabel leaned closer to the glass. For the first time since the divorce, the cabin did not feel like the end of her life. It felt like someone had left a trail, and Calvin had been too proud to see it. By mid-morning, the stamped metal plate behind the trees was still on Mabel's mind. The workers were gone. Their truck was gone. But those numbers stayed with her. She wanted to walk back there and look closer, but the cabin had its own list of problems. A leak over the kitchen window, a loose board near the stove, a front door that had to be lifted before it would close, a cold draft slipping under the bedroom wall like the place had been waiting years to remind someone it was broken. Mabel found an old roll of tape in one drawer and a cracked bucket under the sink. She used both before breakfast. Not because she knew how to fix a cabin, because nobody else was coming. By noon, she drove into town in the borrowed sedan her cousin had left her for the week. Athens County looked the way it always did in early winter. Wet roads, bare trees, low gray clouds resting over the hills. But Mabel felt different inside it now. Not invisible. Worse, visible in the way people look at a woman after her life has been discussed behind closed doors. At the grocery store, people noticed her before they spoke. That was the painful part. The pause, the careful smile, the voice lowered just enough to sound kind. A woman from church touched her arm and said Calvin was holding up well. Mabel nodded. She had learned that some people asked questions only so they could feel decent afterward. Near the canned goods, two men stopped talking when she passed. One of them glanced at her coat, the same coat she had slept in the night before. The sleeve still carried a faint water stain from the ceiling leak. Mabel kept walking. She bought bread, soup, coffee, batteries, and the cheapest plastic she could find for the windows. At the register, the young cashier asked if she wanted help carrying the bags. Mabel almost said no. Then she looked at her hands. They were steady, but tired. Yes, she said. Outside, she saw Calvin. He stood near the entrance beside a man from the bank, laughing like a person whose life had not been split open. His coat was clean, his shoes were dry. The truck beside him looked newer than anything Mabel had ever owned by herself. Calvin saw her. For 1 second his smile did not move. Then he came over. Slow, pleasant, public. He asked if she was managing okay out there. Out there. Not home. Not the cabin. Out there. Mabel could have told him about the leaking roof, the mouse under the sink, the cold floor beside the bed. She could have told him about the utility workers walking behind the cabin before dawn. But something stopped her. A small instinct. A quiet one. So she only said she was managing. Calvin smiled like that pleased him. On the drive back, Mabel saw a white utility truck turn ahead of her. Same company logo. Same clean doors. Same careful speed. It took the back road toward her cabin. Mabel slowed, then followed. Not close enough to be seen, just close enough to know. The truck did not stop at any neighbor's house. It did not turn toward the main power poles near the road. It went past all of that, toward the old service path behind her property. Mabel pulled onto the shoulder and watched it disappear between the trees. For years, people in town had looked at that cabin and seen a woman with nothing left. But someone else kept coming back like something behind it needed guarding. When Mabel reached home, the truck was gone. But fresh tire marks cut through the mud beside the path, and near the locked metal box, one patch of weeds had been pressed flat, as if someone had stood there for a long time, looking down at something Mabel had not yet found. The flattened weeds looked fresh. That was what troubled Mabel most. Not the tire tracks. Those could be explained away. A truck came through, a worker checked something, rain would blur the marks by morning. But the weeds beside the locked metal box had been pressed down in one careful shape, as if someone had stood there for a long time while Mabel was in town. Watching, reading, maybe waiting. Mabel stayed on the porch with one grocery bag still hooked over her wrist. The cabin creaked behind her. The back field sat quiet ahead of her. For most of her marriage, she had learned not to step into places Calvin said were not her concern. Bank papers, Business files, insurance forms, property records. He never shouted when he moved those things away from her. He simply smiled and said he would handle it. And after enough years, being handled started to feel normal. But this was different. The envelope on the counter said the cabin was hers. The mud said strangers had been behind it. So Mabel set the groceries inside, took the small flashlight from the bag, and walked toward the tree line. The ground was soft from rain. Dead leaves clung to her shoes. The air smelled of wet bark and old metal. Halfway across the field, she noticed the path. It was narrow, but not forgotten. Small stones had been pressed into the mud where tires would sink. Branches were trimmed back just enough for a truck to pass. The weeds on both sides had grown wild, but the center line stayed open. Someone had been maintaining it, quietly. Not for the cabin, for whatever waited behind it. The locked box stood beside two old marker posts, dull gray, bolted to a short concrete base. A faded company label curled at the edge. Beneath the lock were numbers stamped into the metal. Mabel copied them onto the back of her grocery receipt. Her hand shook, but she did not stop. Then she saw the plate. It was low to the ground, half buried under moss and wet leaves. She crouched carefully, wiped it with her sleeve, and leaned closer. More numbers, a few worn letters, then one word clear enough to read. Corridor. Mabel stared at it. The word felt official. Not like a warning, more like a secret someone forgot to cover. A voice came from the fence line. You finally saw it. Mabel turned so fast, the receipt nearly slipped from her hand. Clara Wynne stood on the other side of the old fence with a feed bucket against her hip. Silver hair, faded knit cap, sharp eyes that had seen more than she usually said. Mabel pressed one hand against her chest. Clara, you scared me. Clara looked past her to the box. They've been coming for years. Mabel glanced back at the path. Who? Utility men. Sometimes two, sometimes one. More after storms. One. Mabel swallowed. Did they ever talk to my uncle? Clara's face tightened. Not after he died. The sentence landed quietly, but it changed the air around them. Mabel looked down at the stamped plate again. Then who gave them permission? Clara did not answer right away. She only shifted the bucket in her hand and looked toward the cabin, as if deciding how much truth a woman could carry in one day. Finally, she said, if that land was mine, I'd ask that question before signing anything. Mabel went still. Signing what? Clara's eyes moved to the folded receipt in Mabel's hand. Sooner or later, they always bring papers. That night, Mabel placed the receipt on the kitchen table. The stamped numbers sat under the yellow light. And beneath them, one word. Corridor. She did not sleep much, because before dawn, headlights moved across the front window. Not behind the cabin this time, in the driveway. Then came 3 knocks at the door, and a man's voice calling her name. The knocks came again. 3 of them. Measured. Patient. Certain. Like the man outside already knew Mabel would open the door. She stood in the kitchen, one hand resting near the receipt on the table. The stamped numbers from the locked box stared up under the weak yellow light. And beneath them, corridor. The voice came again. Mrs. Renshaw? Mabel pulled her coat tighter and crossed the room. When she opened the door, a man stood on the leaning porch with a leather folder under one arm. He was clean-shaven, neatly dressed, and wore a dark jacket with the utility company logo stitched over the chest. Behind him sat a white company truck. Same logo. Same clean doors. Same careful silence. Good morning, ma'am, he said. Aaron Pike, Buckeye Regional Utilities. Mabel kept one hand on the doorframe. At 70, she had learned that official-looking men with folders often arrived with their minds already made up. Aaron glanced past her into the cabin. Only briefly, but long enough to see the metal bowl on the floor. The plastic taped over the window. The blanket folded near the chair. Then he looked back at her with a softer voice. We're updating property owner paperwork in this area, he said. Yours is one of the last forms we need. One of the last Not the first. Not the only. The last. Mabel did not invite him in. Aaron opened the folder and removed a clipped stack of papers. "It's a routine renewal," he said. "The agreement has been in place for years. We just need the current property owner's signature." Current property owner. The words should have felt like protection. Instead, they made Mabel think of Calvin's envelope. Mabel's property now. Aaron held out the papers. Mabel looked down. Lines of text, boxes, dates. Her full name typed near the bottom. Mabel Elaine Renshaw. Her name looked strange inside a document she did not understand. For years, Calvin had made papers sound harmless. "Just sign there. I already checked it. No need to worry yourself." And Mabel would sign, not because she was foolish, because peace in that house often came from not making Calvin explain himself. Aaron uncapped a pen. "This keeps everything uninterrupted," he said. A formality, really. There it was. That little word. Smooth enough to pass through a room unnoticed. Heavy enough to cost a woman everything. Mabel looked past Aaron's shoulder toward the side yard. She could not see the service path from the porch, but she could feel it back there. The locked box. The stamped plate. Clara's warning. Sooner or later, they always bring papers. Mabel took the document. Not the pen. Aaron waited. The porch creaked beneath his polished shoes. She turned the first page slowly. The words blurred at first. Easement, renewal, access, maintenance, continuity, release. She did not know enough to argue, but she knew enough not to pretend. "What happens," she asked, "if I don't sign it today?" Aaron's smile held, but his eyes changed. Just for a second. "Well," he said carefully, "delay is not ideal. This corridor supports essential service infrastructure. We try to avoid interruptions or legal gaps. Essential." Mabel held on to that word. Not useless. Not worthless. Not limited value. Essential. She folded the papers once and held them against her coat. "I'll need time to read this." Aaron's fingers tightened slightly around the pen. "Of course," he said, "but the renewal window is narrow. Sooner is better for everyone." Everyone. Mabel had heard that word before too. It usually meant she was supposed to be quiet so other people could stay comfortable. Aaron handed her a business card and stepped back from the porch. He stayed polite, too polite to sound threatening, too practiced to look worried. But before he got into the truck, he turned his head toward the back field. Not the cabin. The land. Mabel closed the door and leaned against it until the engine faded down the road. Only then did she breathe. She carried the papers to the kitchen table and set them beside the grocery receipt. The reference numbers matched. Same corridor. Same locked box. Same path Calvin had never mentioned when he left her the cabin. Mabel opened a drawer and found an old county tax bill with her uncle's name on it. The paper was yellow at the edges, but the parcel number was still clear. She copied it carefully beneath Aaron's reference number. For the first time in 40 years, Mabel was not going to sign first and understand later. By noon, she was driving toward the Athens County Records office, with 2 numbers on a receipt, and one question Calvin never expected her to ask. The Athens County Records office sat behind the courthouse in a brick building Mabel had passed for years. That morning, it felt different, like the kind of place Calvin would enter without hesitation, and the kind of place Mabel had been taught to avoid unless someone guided her. She stood outside with Aaron Pike's unsigned papers under one arm. In her coat pocket was the grocery receipt with the stamped numbers copied on the back. 2 numbers, 1 word, corridor. That was all she had. Not proof, not courage, but enough to keep her from turning around. Inside, the air smelled of paper, dust, and floor cleaner. A copier hummed near the wall. File drawers lined the back room like quiet witnesses. At the counter sat a clerk with narrow glasses and gray hair pinned behind one ear. Her nameplate read, Denise Harlan. "How can I help you?" Mabel placed Aaron's papers on the counter. "I need to understand something about my property." The word property still felt unfamiliar. Denise glanced at the first page, then at Mabel. "Renshaw cabin?" Mabel went still. You know it? My father delivered propane out that way, Denise said. Said that road could shake a truck apart. It was a small thing. But it was the first time anyone had mentioned the cabin without pity. Mabel unfolded the receipt and showed her the numbers. I found these behind the place, on a locked box, and on a plate in the ground. Denise adjusted her glasses. Her face did not change much. But her silence did. Let's pull the parcel file. She led Mabel to a side desk and began searching. At first, the screen showed ordinary records, tax history, old parcel maps, previous owners, a faded property sketch. Then Mabel saw her uncle's name. Below it, her mother's maiden name. For one quiet second, the cabin stopped being Calvin's insult. It became family land again. Denise printed 2 maps and placed them under a desk lamp. She traced one finger along the back corner of the property. There, she said. Mabel leaned closer. A thin line crossed the land behind the cabin. It was narrow, almost easy to miss. But it ran exactly where the tire tracks had been. Denise opened an archived document. The scan was faint. The words were crowded together. Mabel read slowly. Then Denise turned the page toward her. 4 words sat in the middle of the paragraph. Private corridor access agreement. They looked plain, almost harmless, but Mabel felt the room tighten around them. What does that mean? It means someone has legal access across part of the property, Denise said. Usually for utilities, service lines, maintenance, things like that. Mabel thought of the box, the gravel patches, the trimmed branches. So they can just come and go? Denise paused. They may have permission, but the terms matter. Terms. Another word Calvin had always made sound too complicated for her. Denise clicked deeper into the file. The agreement had been signed decades earlier, when Mabel's uncle was still alive. Back then, the corridor supported a basic utility route along the trees. Nothing about it sounded rich. Nothing about it sounded like rescue. Then Denise opened a newer service map. The same thin strip appeared again. Only now, the labels had changed. Fiber route, service junction, maintenance access, emergency communications link. Mabel did not understand every phrase, but she understood enough. This was not a deadline behind an old cabin. People depended on it. Denise lowered her voice. This route appears to support more than it used to. Mabel looked down at Aaron's papers. Routine renewal. Just a formality. One of the last forms we need. Why would they need me now? Denise checked the date on the old agreement. Because this may be close to expiring. Mabel sat very still. The copier kept humming. A phone rang somewhere behind them. The world kept moving like nothing had changed. But something had. The cabin was still rotting. The roof still leaked. Calvin still had the house. But the story he left her with had cracked. Denise kept reading. Then her finger stopped. Wait. Mabel looked up. Denise read the line again, slower. There were payments attached to this. Mabel's hand tightened on the table. Payments? Annual access payments, Denise said. They were supposed to go to the property owner. She searched another record, then another. Her mouth tightened. After your uncle died, some notices went to an outdated address. A few payments were returned. Some were marked unresolved. Mabel did not speak. She looked at the 4 words again. Private corridor access agreement. For years, people had looked at the porch, the roof, and the cracked windows, then stopped looking. But behind the cabin, a narrow strip of land had been carrying value through the trees. And money had been trying to find its way to the owner. While Mabel slept under a leaking roof, Denise closed the folder gently. You need a land use attorney. Mabel left with copied maps, payment records, and an attorney's name on a yellow sticky note. Outside, the courthouse bell rang noon. Mabel stood on the sidewalk with the papers against her chest. Aaron Pike had not come early because the cabin was worthless. He had come because her signature was not. And now Mabel needed to know how long the money had been missing, and who had been comfortable letting it stay that way. Mabel did not drive straight back to the cabin. She sat in the courthouse parking lot with both hands on the steering wheel, the copied maps resting on the passenger seat beside her. The yellow sticky note was stuck to the top page. Gretchen Malloy, land use attorney. Under the name was a phone number Denise had written in careful blue ink. Mabel stared at it for a long time. Calling an attorney felt expensive. It felt serious. It felt like stepping into a room where people used words she did not fully understand, and expected her to pretend she did. But the papers beside her were not feelings. They were records, and records did not care what Calvin thought she was capable of. So Mabel drove to a small office 2 streets over from the courthouse, where the sign in the window read, Malloy Property and Land Rights. Gretchen Malloy was not what Mabel expected. No grand desk, no sharp voice, no hurry. She was a woman in her late 50s, with reading glasses on a chain and a stack of property files on one side of her desk. She listened without interrupting as Mabel laid out the maps, Aaron Pike's renewal papers, the grocery receipt, and the returned payment notes from the county file. When Mabel finished, Gretchen did not smile. She only pulled the papers closer. "That company wants something," she said. Mabel swallowed. "They said it was routine." "It may be routine for them," Gretchen said. "That does not make it small for you." Those words settled somewhere deep. Gretchen read through the old agreement first, then the newer service map, then Aaron's renewal form. The room was quiet except for the soft turning of pages. Mabel watched Gretchen's face for clues. A raised eyebrow, a tight mouth, a pause over one paragraph. Each small movement made Mabel's heartbeat pick up. Finally, Gretchen set the renewal paper down. "The old agreement was written when this corridor carried much less value," she said. "Basic service access mostly. But this updated map shows expanded infrastructure." "Fiber," Mabel said, remembering the word from the record. Gretchen nodded. "Fiber. Service junctions. Maintenance access. Possibly emergency communication support. That changes the conversation." Mabel looked down at her hands. "So, is it worth something?" Gretchen leaned back. "The cabin may not be. The access rights are." For a moment, Mabel could not answer. All those years, Calvin had called the place a ruin. The court had called it limited. The town had treated it like evidence of her fall. But Gretchen was looking at the same papers and seeing something else entirely. "Now," Gretchen said, tapping the returned payment notes, "this part matters too." Mabel leaned closer. "Were those payments owed to my uncle?" "Some likely were. We need to verify the history. But if payments were returned or held after his death, there may be unpaid amounts tied to the property." "How much?" Gretchen did not rush. "Maybe not a fortune by itself." Mabel's shoulders lowered. Then Gretchen added, "But the back payments are not the real leverage." Mabel looked up. "The renewal is." Gretchen turned Aaron's form around and pointed to the signature line. "They need the current owner to keep their access clean. If the old agreement is expiring, your signature gives them certainty. That has value." Mabel stared at her own typed name. Mabel Elaine Renshaw. For once, it was not written on a label meant to shame her. It was written in a place where someone needed her permission. Gretchen's voice softened. "Do not sign anything yet." Mabel almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. "For 40 years I signed whatever Calvin put in front of me." Gretchen did not pity her. That helped. "Then this is a good time to stop." Outside the office window, cars moved along the wet street. People crossed with bags, umbrellas, coffee cups, ordinary life. But inside that room, Mabel felt the first small edge of power. Not loud power. Not revenge. Just the quiet kind that comes when a woman realizes she is allowed to ask what something is worth before she gives it away. Gretchen made copies of everything and promised to review the payment history. As Mabel stood to leave, the office phone rang. Gretchen answered, listened for a moment, then looked at Mabel. Her expression changed. Not fear, recognition. She covered the receiver with one hand. "It's Buckeye Regional Utilities," she said. "They're asking whether you've signed yet." Mabel felt the papers tighten against her chest. Aaron Pike had waited less than 1 day, and suddenly, the question was no longer whether the corridor mattered. It was why they needed her answer so quickly. Buckeye Regional Utilities did not wait long. By the next afternoon, Aaron Pike called Mabel himself. His voice was calm, polite, careful in the way people sound when they are trying not to reveal urgency. He thanked her for her time. He said he understood she wanted to review the paperwork. He said the company valued good relationships with property owners. Then he made the offer. Not in a threatening way, not even in an unkind way. That almost made it harder. Because the number sounded large to Mabel, large enough to patch the roof, large enough to replace the broken window, large enough to buy a proper heater before the cold settled deeper into the hills. For a few seconds, Mabel did not hear the rest of what he said. She only saw the bedroom ceiling without water stains, the kitchen floor without soft boards, a used car in her own name, a winter where she did not have to count soup cans in the grocery aisle. Aaron said the offer would simplify the renewal. He said it would avoid delays. He said the company could have the agreement prepared quickly if she was comfortable moving forward. Comfortable. That word almost made her look around the cabin and laugh. Nothing about her life was comfortable, but that was the danger. A desperate woman could mistake relief for fairness. Mabel wrote the number down on the back of an old envelope. Then she thanked him and said her attorney would respond. The silence on the other end lasted only a breath, but Mabel heard it. After the call, she sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of her. The amount looked even bigger in her handwriting. For a moment, she imagined signing, just signing. No more phone calls, no more offices, no more documents she had to read 3 times. Just money, enough to make the cabin stop feeling like punishment. Then, she saw Calvin's envelope lying in the drawer. Mabel's property now. He had counted on her being tired. Maybe Buckeye was counting on the same thing. That evening, Gretchen called. Her voice was steady, but Mabel could hear the warning underneath. They made a first offer because they want control of the pace, she said. Is it bad? It is not nothing, Gretchen said, but it asks you to give too much. Mabel closed her eyes. What does that mean? It means the money may solve this winter, while the agreement controls the next 20 years. That sentence stayed with her. Gretchen explained the problems in plain words. The maintenance language was vague. The road repair was not guaranteed. The company wanted broad access rights. The back payment issue was not clearly settled. And one section limited what Mabel could claim later if equipment work damaged the land. Mabel listened with a pencil in her hand. She wrote down only the words she understood. Road, damage, back payments, future rights. They looked simple on paper, but each one felt like a door she had almost handed someone else the key to. Gretchen did not tell her what to do. That mattered too. Calvin had always turned advice into instruction. He made decisions and called them help. Gretchen gave information, then waited for Mabel to choose. What would happen if we asked questions? Mabel said. Then they would have to answer. And if they don't like it? Gretchen's reply came quietly. They still need access. Mabel looked toward the dark kitchen window. Beyond it, the back field had disappeared into night. She could not see the locked box, but she knew where it stood. For the first time, the hidden part of the property did not feel like something happening to her. It felt like something she had a right to understand. Ask the questions, Mabel said. The next morning, Gretchen sent Buckeye a response. Not an acceptance. A list. Payment history. Maintenance records. Updated corridor maps. Access logs. Road repair obligations. Damage protections. Future expansion language. By noon, Buckeye confirmed they had received it. By 3 o'clock, Clara Wynne called from the neighboring property. Her voice was low. Mabel, she said, there's a man at your back fence taking pictures. Mabel stood so quickly the chair scraped the floor. Utility? No, Clara said. A pause. Then the words that made the room go cold. It's Calvin. Calvin was standing near the back fence when Mabel reached the edge of the field. Not on her porch, not by the driveway, not anywhere a visitor with innocent reasons would wait. He was behind the cabin, holding his phone up toward the locked metal box. For a moment, Mabel stopped walking. The wind moved through the bare trees. The grass was wet around her shoes. Somewhere beyond the fence line, Clara Wynne stood watching from her side of the property, arms folded, face tight with concern. Calvin lowered the phone when he saw Mabel. Then he smiled, the same public smile he had used in grocery stores, bank offices, and church parking lots. Mabel, he said, I was just checking on you. She looked at the phone in his hand. From behind the cabin, his smile thinned. I heard you were having some confusion with utility paperwork. Confusion. There it was. One word, dressed like concern. Mabel felt the old pull in her chest, the old instinct to explain herself before he accused her of something, to soften her voice, to make him comfortable so the moment would pass. But the field behind her was hers. The papers on Gretchen's desk were hers. And Calvin was standing where he had no reason to be. I'm not confused, she said. Calvin looked toward the locked box. Well, I hope not. These things can get complicated. You never liked dealing with documents. Mabel heard Clara shift near the fence, but neither woman spoke. Calvin stepped closer to one of the metal posts and tapped it lightly with his shoe. I just don't want you being taken advantage of. It almost sounded kind. That was what made it ugly. For 40 years, Calvin had hidden control inside concern. He had called it protection when he kept her from the bank statements. He had called it stress relief when he handled the accounts alone. He had called it marriage when he made decisions without asking her. Now he was doing it again. On the same land he had laughed at. Mabel looked past him at the service path. Fresh tire marks still cut through the mud. The locked box sat silent in the weeds. A few days earlier, it had been nothing to her. Now it felt like the first object in years that had made men tell the truth without meaning to. Calvin slipped the phone into his coat pocket. I spoke with someone, he said. Mabel waited. He disliked silence when he was not controlling it. The corridor was there during the marriage, he continued. If there's money involved, I would think it should be handled fairly. Fairly. Mabel almost smiled. Not because anything was funny, because the word sounded strange coming from the man who had left her under a leaking roof. You called this place worthless, she said. Calvin's face hardened, then softened again quickly. I said it had limited use. That's different. You let your lawyer say it had limited value. That was based on what we knew at the time. What we knew. Mabel looked at him carefully. For the first time, she realized how often Calvin used shared words when blame appeared. We, us, our mistake. But when there was something to take, he knew exactly how to say mine. The cabin is mine, Mabel said. Calvin gave a small sigh. Not angry. Worse. Patient. Like she was being difficult in a way he had expected. Mabel, don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm trying to keep you from getting tangled in something you don't understand. The sentence would have worked on her once, maybe even a week ago, back when the envelope on the counter still felt like the final word. But now she had seen the county maps. She had heard Gretchen explain the renewal. She had watched Aaron Pike's smile pause when she refused to sign. She did not understand everything, but she understood enough. I have an attorney, she said. Calvin blinked, just once. Then his mouth tightened. You hired a lawyer? No, Mabel said. I hired someone to read what other people hoped I wouldn't. The wind moved between them. For the first time since the divorce, Calvin had no quick answer. Clara's voice came from the fence, calm and dry. You're on her property, Calvin. He glanced toward her, irritated by the witness. Then he turned back to Mabel. This isn't over. Mabel felt the words land, but they did not knock her backward. Then you should speak to my attorney. Calvin stared at her for another second. Then he walked back toward his truck, his steps leaving dark prints in the wet grass. Mabel watched him go. Only after his engine faded did she realize her hands were shaking. Clara came to the fence. You all right? Mabel looked toward the locked box, then at the spot where Calvin had been taking pictures. No, she said softly. Not yet. That evening, Gretchen called. Calvin's lawyer had sent a letter. It claimed the divorce settlement may have been based on incomplete property information and requested that Mabel pause all negotiations until Calvin's rights could be reviewed. Mabel sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her. The cabin was quiet. The roof dripped once into the metal bowl, and for the first time the thing Calvin had thrown away was something he was trying to take back. Mabel read Calvin's lawyer's letter 3 times, not because it was long, because every sentence felt designed to make her doubt herself. Incomplete property information, possible marital interest, pause all negotiations, review of rights. The words sat on the page like closed doors. For a few minutes Mabel was back in the courthouse again, hands folded, mouth dry, listening to people speak about her life as if she were not the one who had lived it. That was Calvin's gift. Even when he was not in the room, he knew how to make her feel watched. She almost called Gretchen and asked if she should stop everything. Almost. Then she looked across the kitchen table. Aaron Pike's papers were there. The county maps were there. The grocery receipt was there too, with the word corridor written in her own hand. For once, Mabel had not imagined something. She had followed it. The next morning, she met Gretchen at the records office. Denise Harlan was already waiting with 2 folders and a paper cup of coffee cooling beside her keyboard. No one wasted time. That helped. Denise pulled the original corridor filing first. The document had been recorded decades earlier, stamped, indexed, and attached to the parcel file. It was not buried in a shoebox. It was not hidden behind a wall. It was not some secret only Mabel could have known. It had been there, in public records, waiting for anyone serious enough to look. Gretchen read silently, then made a note. Calvin's attorney had access to this, she said. Denise nodded. So did the appraiser. Mabel looked at the old document. You mean they could have found it before the divorce? They could have, Gretchen said, if they checked the full file. The answer was simple. That made it heavier. Calvin had fought over the house because he respected it. He fought over the savings because he understood them. He fought over the car because he could see its value. But the cabin, he had looked at the porch, the roof, the cracked windows, and stopped thinking, just like everyone else. Denise opened the next folder. This is the payment trail. The early payments were small. Old checks, notices, returned mail, a change of address form that had never been completed after Mabel's uncle died. Then came a gap, then unresolved entries. Then a notation that said payments were being held pending owner confirmation. Mabel touched the edge of the page, but not the writing. So the money didn't vanish? Not all of it, Gretchen said. Some may still be recoverable, but this is bigger than old checks. She turned to a recent corridor map. The thin line behind the cabin was marked with newer labels now. Fiber route, service junction, maintenance access, emergency communications support. Gretchen tapped the page once. The original agreement was written for a much smaller use. The company has more writing on this corridor now. That is why they want a clean renewal. Mabel thought of Aaron at her door, his polite smile, his early visit, his pen already uncapped. He wanted me to sign before I knew what it was. Gretchen did not soften the truth. Yes. For a long moment, Mabel said nothing. She was angry, but not in the way she expected. It was not hot. It was not loud. It did not make her want to throw anything. It was quieter than that, a steady anger, the kind that helps a woman sit up straighter. Gretchen slid Calvin's lawyer's letter across the table. This letter is meant to scare you. It does not prove he has a claim. Mabel looked at the phrase incomplete property information again. For once, the words did not feel larger than her. Was the information incomplete? Mabel asked. Or did he just not care enough to read it? Denise looked up. Gretchen's expression changed slightly. Not surprise. Respect. That, Gretchen said, is the right question. They spent the next hour gathering copies. The original filing, the parcel index, the payment notes, the service map, the divorce valuation that called the cabin a low-value rural structure. Piece by piece, the truth became less emotional and more solid. Calvin had not been tricked. He had been arrogant. And arrogance, for once, had signed the wrong property away. That afternoon, Gretchen sent a response to Calvin's attorney. No pause in negotiations. No admission of hidden value. No agreement that Calvin had rights to future payments. All further contact through counsel. Mabel read the final line before Gretchen sent it. It was plain, professional, almost cold. But to Mabel, it sounded like a door locking behind her. Not locking her in, locking Calvin out. By evening, Buckeye Regional Utilities sent a revised offer. The number was larger, much larger. But Gretchen's message beneath it was short. Better, still not safe. Mabel sat at the kitchen table as darkness gathered against the windows. For the first time, powerful people were waiting for her answer. Calvin, the utility company, their lawyers, their deadlines. Mabel looked toward the back field, where the locked box sat beyond the trees. Then she folded the revised offer and placed it beside the old envelope Calvin had left her. One paper had tried to shame her. The other tried to rush her. And tomorrow, Mabel would have to decide whether she was still the kind of woman who signed because someone was waiting. By morning, Mabel had read the revised offer twice, not because she understood every clause, because she finally understood the part that mattered most. Her signature was not a favor. It was permission, and permission belonged to the owner. At 10 o'clock, Gretchen Malloy arrived at the cabin with a folder under one arm and mud on the edge of her shoes. She did not complain about the road. She did not look around the cabin with pity. She only set the folder on the kitchen table and said the company had agreed to meet in person. Mabel nodded. The old version of her would have asked what Calvin thought. The new version only asked where she needed to sit. The meeting happened 2 days later, in a plain conference room at Buckeye Regional Utilities. No polished courtroom, no judge, no Calvin beside her, clearing his throat whenever she hesitated. Just Mabel, Gretchen, Aaron Pike, and a senior company representative named Lowell Briggs. Lowell was courteous, too courteous. He thanked Mabel for her patience. He said Buckeye valued cooperation with property owners. He said the company wanted a fair solution that protected everyone. Mabel listened. She had learned to be careful with that word. Everyone. Gretchen opened the folder and went line by line. Back payments, annual access fee, road repair, maintenance schedule, damage protections, limits on expansion, future review if the corridor changed again. Each phrase sounded small by itself, but together they were the difference between being used and being protected. Mabel did not speak much. She did not need to. She watched Aaron Pike avoid her eyes when Gretchen asked why the first offer had included such broad release language. She watched Lowell shift in his chair when the unpaid records were mentioned. She watched two men learn, slowly, that the woman they had expected to rush was not rushing. At one point, Lowell slid the final agreement across the table. "This is a very strong offer, Mrs. Renshaw." Mabel looked at it, then at Gretchen, then back at Lowell. "I know," she said, and she did not pick up the pen. Not yet. The room stayed still. For 40 years, Mabel had signed papers to end discomfort. She had signed to keep peace. She had signed because Calvin sighed, because lawyers waited, because men in clean shirts always seemed so certain. But this time, she read every page, every line Gretchen had marked, every place where the land behind her cabin was no longer treated like an empty strip of weeds. When she finally signed, her hand was steady, not because she was fearless, because she understood. The agreement gave her back payments, a substantial renewal payment, yearly access income, road repairs, maintenance rules, written protection if the company damaged her land, and a review clause if the corridor grew more valuable in the future. It was not lottery money. It was better than that. It was security with her name on it. The roof was repaired first, then the porch, then the cracked windows. By spring, the cabin still looked old, but it no longer looked defeated. The front steps held. The kitchen light stayed steady. The bedroom ceiling was dry. Mabel bought a used car in her own name and opened a savings account Calvin could not see, touch, question, or explain away. Calvin came once more. He stood at the edge of the porch, looking at the new railing, the cleared path, the papers in Gretchen's hand. His voice was softer now. He said 40 years should count for something. Mabel looked at him for a long moment, and she understood. When the cabin was broken, it was hers. When the land became valuable, he called it theirs. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She only told him he had already chosen what he believed she was worth. Then she closed the door. Months later, Mabel sat on the repaired porch with a cup of coffee warming her hands. The hills behind the cabin were green again. The service path had been graded clean. The locked metal box still stood near the trees, but it no longer felt like a secret. A Buckeye utility truck rolled slowly along the back route. This time, the driver stopped at the marker post. He looked toward the porch. Then he raised one hand. Not pity, not charity. Respect. Mabel raised hers back. Calvin had taken the house, the savings, the car, the life he thought made him powerful. But he had left Mabel the one thing he never bothered to understand: the land beneath her feet. The fortune hidden behind that rotting cabin was not just money. It was dignity. It was safety. It was the right to say no and be heard. And if Mabel's story reminded you that quiet people are often carrying more strength than anyone sees, take 1 second to like this video. Subscribe if you believe women like Mabel should not have to disappear before the truth finally matters. And tell me in the comments, if Calvin had thrown that cabin at you like an insult, then came back asking for a share when it became valuable, would you have opened the door or left him standing on the porch?